We're going to be talking about 7 principles for improving and enriching our fellowship, and I'm going to tell you that I'm going to be reflecting 3 sources as I share with you the principles that I will give today. Number 1, of course, is the Word of God. We're going to be talking about God's Word when it comes to fellowship. Number 2, I'm going to be reflecting my experiences at the College Avenue Church of Christ in El Dorado, Arkansas. I was there, as Wayne said, for 28 and a half years, and that was a fantastic fellowship. That was the kind of church where the nurses in the hospital would tell friends, if you want a good church, go to the College Avenue Church of Christ, because they saw the fellowship. That was the kind of church where newcomers would visit our congregation. They had just moved into town, and they would be Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, or whatever, and we would say, well, what led you to come here? Well, my neighbor said, that's a good church. Well, who's your neighbor? And they would be a Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or whatever. Even the denominational people said, go to that church. That's a good church. It's the kind of church where people would walk in and they would tell me, Dan, the minute I walked in this building, I felt a buzz, I felt an energy, I knew this is where I wanted to be. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about fellowship. I'm talking about a congregation that has bonds that are rich and deep and pure. And so we're going to be talking about that. From the Word of God, I'm going to be reflecting my experience at College Avenue, but we will begin with some social science research. I don't expect anybody to know, but just in case, how many people here, has anybody here ever read or heard of Bowling Alone? Okay, I've got one individual, two individuals. Bowling Alone. Bowling Alone is a book that came out several years ago. It is a massive, groundbreaking work of social research. It is a study, a huge, huge study of American culture. When I say huge, I'm talking about nearly half a million interviews over the last quarter century. Robert Putnam led this effort, and they were studying American society. And let me just give you the Reader's Digest version of what they found. Through the first 2/3 of the last century, from 1900 to the 1960s, measures of social involvement in the United States, in American culture, increased year by year. And we're talking about participation in community groups. We're talking about charitable giving. We're talking about people belonging to political organizations. We're talking about all nature of social interactions. We're talking about measures of trustworthiness, people's perceptions of their neighbors, their friends, their coworkers. All of these things that talk about and reflect social connectedness got better and better and better and better. And then in the last third of the last century, they fell off a cliff. Something happened to diminish social connections, civic participation, organizational participation, church membership, all sorts of community life, and what social scientists, researchers call social capital, the bonds that make society sound and healthy. Something happened in the last third of the last century to cause all of these measures across the board to go down, 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 down. The book got its name from participation in league bowling. People who participated in league bowling on teams and organized events went up, and you'll see the spike there along about 1960-something. And then all of a sudden, it just falls off a cliff and goes down, 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 down. Participation in the PTA has gone down dramatically. Participation in civic clubs from 1975 to 1999 dropped 58%. And I personally saw this when I joined Rotary back in the 80s. We had a full house. When I had to leave Rotary several years ago, we were struggling to maintain our membership. It has gone down. Lions Club, Kiwanis, you name it, they've all gone down. Leadership in those organizations, trying to find someone to be a president, vice president, treasurer, secretary in social organizations is like pulling teeth in social organizations today. What's called informal socializing, just having people over to your house, dropped 35% from 1965 to 1995. Even something as mundane as playing cards. I can remember when folks got together to play rook. Now, you didn't play spot cards because that's a sin, but you could play rook. Okay? You could play rook. People don't do that much anymore. Having friends over, 35% drop. Family dinners, 43% decrease. Attending club meetings, 58% decline. What is astounding is that it's across the board. all of the measures of social connectedness started going down, down, down. Now, why is this significant? Well, let me give you a couple of reasons why it's significant. First of all, loneliness equals depression. I am a professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I deal with depression. Depression in America is now 10 times as prevalent as it was back in 1960. Depression in America now strikes at a much younger age. The mean age of a person's first episode of depression 40 years ago was 29.5%. Today it is 14.5%. Depression has been called the common cold of mental illness. We have something in our society that's sick. There's something inherently unhealthy about American culture. Why is that significant? People who are not in a group are twice as likely to die in the next year as those who are in a group. Now, I want you to just pay attention to that for just a minute. People who have strong social connections but poor health habits, eating, exercise, smoking, are just as healthy as those with good health habits but weak social connections. All right, so go to church and take up smoking. Won't bother you. No, that's not the conclusion. No. I just want you to notice how important to human flourishing are social connections. Now, let's ask ourselves a question. What changed? Why has modern society become so socially isolated, disconnected, and depressed? Now, that's what Putnam was trying to figure out. One of the things is very obvious in that there is a generational divide. If you look at individuals, what Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation, the World War II generation, those folks were civic-minded, they were politically organized, they were socially connected. They went to church, they had their families in PTA. That generation was the high point of social connection in America. After that, baby boomers, not so much. Not so much. What happened to erode our social connections? Putnam advances several answers. One is the breakdown of the traditional family unit. Those of you who are my age, I'm 60 years old, have seen it just fall apart. It's one of the reasons why I'm a marriage and family therapist. So many families are struggling today. Divorce rate skyrocketing. Single parenthood has gone through the roof. Breakdown of the traditional family. Those people are not as socially connected as two-parent families. Two-career families. When you do have mom and dad in the home, they're both working full-time, they're both tired at the end of the day, they don't have as much time as usual. It used to be with the PTA, let's be honest, who ran it? Yeah, mom. That's why PTA has gone down. Racial integration and what he calls white flight has contributed to, Putnam says, has contributed to a loss of social capital. Big government and the growth of the welfare state, according to Putnam, has contributed to the loss of social capital. Suburbanation, living in the suburbs. Okay. Commuting and sprawl has contributed. Generational change, replacement of the greatest generation by the less civic-minded children and grandchildren. Our society has changed. Those of us who have lived long enough to see this happen know what I'm talking about. It has changed. It has changed dramatically. It has not changed for the better. But the biggest influence that Putnam found, and this will come as no surprise, the biggest influence in the loss of social connection is all of those screens that we have our eyeballs glued to all the time, whether it is our television, whether it is our computer, whether it is our tablet, whether it is our cell phone. It has changed, folks. It has changed. He found the strongest correlation between television dependency and social isolation. Now, I want you to think about this. We had in my church years ago, we were teaching a class for the young people on television and media. And it struck me that they had a very distorted perspective because all they knew was looking at a tube. So we actually brought in some of our older couples who had grown up, who were teenagers before television became widely available. And in South Arkansas, it was about 1950. But anyway, before television became widely available, and just talked about what life was like. And our young people, their eyes got big as saucers because the world was very different. And they didn't realize you can live without television. And in fact, you can have a really good time. One of the other things they learned, which is amazing, is when television did first come to some of those homes, it drew the neighbors together because people said they'd get the television, they'd invite all their neighbors, and they'd all come in and they'd watch the wrestling that night together. It was a social event. That doesn't happen anymore. Now, you go in the typical home, Dad has his television, Mom has her television, and every teenager has their television in their own bedroom, which ought to be against the law. And what is happening to family cohesion and family unity and social connectedness? It is gone. It is obliterated. He said it is the single most consistent predictor of social isolation. Nothing, says Putnam, not low education, not full-time work, not long commutes, not poverty or financial distress. Nothing is more broadly associated with social disconnection than is dependence on television for entertainment. The average home has a television on over 7 hours a day. 7 hours a day. Now, that to me is the biggest single explanation for the loss of social connectedness in American society. Now, let me just stop. You're an intelligent-looking group of people. What implications does this have for our churches? What Putnam has discovered about the changes in American society, you tell me.
We don't know how to talk to each other anymore.
We don't know how to talk to each other anymore. By the way, there's some pretty good research evidence that young people growing up texting are having communication skills when it comes to interpersonal communication. All right, we don't know how to talk to each other anymore. What else?
I think there's some great opportunity for churches to fill that void with the social things that are going on.
There's a tremendous mission field out there for people who are craving meaningful connection. We're going to actually talk about that in just a minute. Okay? I have seen Sunday night attendance in a lot of our churches go down. Wednesday night attendance in a lot of our churches go down. We really have to struggle. We really have to struggle now. Well, what are we competing against? Well, we're competing against Netflix and Hulu and cable television, and people have all of this entertainment going on in their home on a big screen TV in high definition. And, you know, it's pretty hard for just a regular old preacher like me to compete with that. In fact, I can't. Social isolation, here's what I want you to understand, and this is the reason I introduced bowling alone. Social isolation is the exact opposite of fellowship. My topic is enriching and enhancing our fellowship, and so I've got to tell you right up front, we got our work cut out for us. We have got our work cut out for us. Now here's a caveat, and I'm going to give you a little bit of hope. Many Americans still connect, but they do so selectively and intentionally. It doesn't just happen anymore. People don't visit the way they used to when I was growing up. It doesn't happen anymore. People don't sit on the front porch anymore. We all got air conditioning. People don't get together on an informal basis and play rook anymore. You got to make things happen, and especially in our churches, we have to make them happen. With that in mind, let me give you 7 principles. If you're filling in your blanks here, here's the first one. We've already covered it. Recognize the changes in American culture and their impact on our churches. Folks, we got to take this one seriously because the world, it's not the world that most of you grew up in. Most of you look like you're maybe 40, 50 years old. It's not the world we grew up in. It's not. We have got to work at this. We have got to take this seriously, which is number 2, if you're filling in your blanks. Preach and teach the essential and countercultural character of the New Testament church. All right? If there was ever a time when we need to restore the first century church, it is now, because we are back in a first century world. We are back in a world where people don't understand God, don't understand fellowship, are saturated with immorality, or saturated with entertainment. We don't go to the Coliseum and watch the lions anymore, eat the Christians. We watch it on television, okay, and a whole lot worse. And we have to preach and teach the essential nature of the New Testament church. The very first Church of Christ, the great Jerusalem church, is summarized in Acts 2:42. They devoted themselves to the apostles' doctrine, to fellowship, to breaking of bread and prayer. And every sermon I've ever heard gets to the apostles' doctrine and stops. Or breaking of bread, and we talk about having the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Okay, if we're going to restore the Lord's Supper and we're going to restore the apostles' doctrine, we need to restore fellowship. It is a restoration imperative. We must, when we talk about the New Testament church and New Testament Christianity, we must go back to New Testament fellowship. And you know all those verses. I'm not going to talk to you about all those verses in Acts about the fellowship of the Jerusalem church, except to say they were deeply interconnected with each other. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. Jesus, our Lord, was countercultural. He set a high value on community. And when you read the Gospels, Jesus expected His followers to practice a radical fellowship. A radical fellowship. Jesus said in John 13:34 and 35, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, so you also must love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." I don't know how He could emphasize it more strongly. Jesus expects us to love each other on a deep, rich, enduring basis. It is a radical sign of discipleship and a dynamic fellowship. I'm going to tell you this from experience, is one of the best evangelistic advantages available. I found over the years, I've studied the Bible with hundreds of people, I found that if I was going to be successful in leading them to the Lord and getting them converted, my odds went up dramatically if I could get them to visit church. Now, if it was just one of these door-knocking things and they never come to my church building, I might be 30% successful, but I'm going to lose 70% of them. But if I could ever get them to come to church, my odds would go up to 50 or 60%. And if I could ever get them to make a meaningful connection at my church with a friend, with someone they cared about, with somebody they knew, my odds went up dramatically. A dynamic fellowship. One of the things we used to do at College Avenue, they still do down there, we've done it for 27 years now, is we would have an annual friend day and a big celebration. It was real positive. We'd feed them catfish and chicken, and we'd have a good sermon that day for a change, and we'd just have a big celebration. And we'd get hundreds of people come. And one of the things that I've routinely heard people say after we studied the Bible with them and converted them is, I didn't realize how many people I knew in your church until I came to Friend Day. And it made me aware of a dynamic that's going on in the mind of the unchurched. When I'm trying to share Jesus with them, they understand that that comes with a commitment. I'm wanting them to be a part of my congregation. They know that. They're not dumb. They understand that. And they're making a mental appraisal and evaluation. Is that somebody I want to connect with? Are those people I want to be a part of? Is there a fellowship there that I would enjoy? I'll guarantee you, if you're in a church right now that's fussing and fighting and going through a split, you're not going to convert very many people. People don't want to get involved with that. They just don't. And so I'm trying to share Jesus with them, and they're thinking, well, yeah, but what are the strings that are attached, and are they good strings? Are they heartstrings? Or are they something else? So a dynamic fellowship is one of the best evangelistic advantages we have available. In our society today, we have got to go back to basics, and we have got to make the case for church. Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. That was the dream of Jesus. Christ loved the church, Ephesians 4:25, and gave Himself up for her. The church was bought with His own blood. We can go all these scriptures. The church, Christ is the head of the body, Colossians 1:18, which is the church. Revelation 21:9, Ephesians 4:23, the church is the bride of Christ. Let us not give up meeting together, but let us encourage one another. How many of us heard that sermon on Hebrews 10:25, and the punchline was, you got to go to church. Don't miss. Well, you do need to go to church, and you shouldn't miss, but that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is, you will spiritually benefit from your participation in a community of faith. You will be encouraged. You will be a stronger, better Christian if you're with your brothers and sisters. Now, why am I saying all this? This just sounds like what I call Homer Simpson theology. Duh, we know that, right? No, the world doesn't know that. You'd be amazed how many people love Jesus, don't care anything about church. They hadn't been taught. They don't know. We have got to go back to basics. There needs to be a community of believers which are joined together by their common fellowship and loyalty to Jesus Christ. And if we are not in a part of such a fellowship, something is missing in our discipleship. We have got to make that case. This generation does not know that. I'll guarantee you the young people, I teach young people every week, the young people, a lot of them, if they grew up in church, do, but a lot of them, they haven't grown up in church. They don't know. We've got to make that case. We've got to make the case for church, and maybe the simplest of all is, how else are we going to practice brotherly love, which is a Christian imperative? Why wouldn't we want to be in a fellowship like that? If you've got a dynamic fellowship where people are loving each other and taking care of each other, you've got something really, really good. So the real answer to the question, church, why bother, is because it's not a bother. They are our brothers. We are a spiritual family. And by the way, if you're elders or preachers here, let me really encourage you to do something. Love on you, church. Love on you, church. Anything you can sincerely publicly say to... You ever read the epistles of Paul? What does he do? Even when he wrote the Corinthians, those confused, divided Corinthians, he loved on them. He said, you've got some good things going on. Love on you, church, every chance you get. Number 3, preach and teach a realistic view of fellowship. Now, let me spend a little time talking about what I mean by this, a realistic view of fellowship. Number 1, we need to recognize that fellowship is an imperative. It is not an option. It is an imperative. Have you ever noticed how many verses there are in the Bible that talk about one another, one another, one another? We are connected, folks. Love one another, encourage one another, honor one another, bear one another's burdens, offer hospitality to each other. We'll come back to that. Be devoted to one another, bear with one another, concern for one another, greet one another, pray for one another. I mean, it is hard to miss. We're supposed to be socially connected. Paul says now about brotherly love, we have no need to write you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. And then he tells the Thessalonians, and in fact you do love all the brothers throughout Macedonia. Yet we urge you, brothers, to do so more and more. I believe Paul would tell us today it is impossible to overemphasize. It is impossible to overemphasize. Look at what he tells the Thessalonians. He said, you already love each other, so you know what you need to do? Do some more. Do it some more. And then do it some more. All right? So, let me be realistic, however. The repeated commands reflect the fact, if you're filling in the blanks, that genuine fellowship is neither easy nor natural. Now, here's the realistic part. It's okay to quote, preach, teach those idealistic commands, love each other. But we might as well get up in the pulpit and say this too. It ain't easy. It ain't easy. What do I mean by that? Well, if you read the undercurrent of the New Testament, there is a dynamic that is always just below the surface, and that is, in the first century congregations, those Jewish followers of Jesus were looking across the aisle at those Gentile followers of Jesus and going, what are they doing here? And those Gentile believers were looking over at those Jews and going, we got to be like them. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. They had to work at it. And by the way, today it's also not easy because a lot of people are not extroverts. We need to be very careful that we don't just assume everybody's going to be a backslapping preacher like me. No. A lot of people are kind of shy and withdrawn, and we got to give them structured opportunities to connect with their brothers and their sisters. That's why Paul says in Ephesians 4:3, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. This is not always easy. An old country preacher was trying to teach a class to a bunch of little children on the subject of kindness. And he was searching for an illustration to make his point. And finally he came upon this one. He said, young people, suppose I was walking down the road and I saw a man by the side of the road beating a mule. He was just being mean and harsh and ugly and just beating that mule, and I stopped him and I made him quit. What Christian virtue would I be practicing? A little voice from the back spoke up and said, brotherly love. Well, let's be honest. Some of our brothers can be pretty mule-headed. Let's be even more honest. So can we. So let me be realistic. I'm not always going to like my brothers and my sisters. And they're not always going to like me. And you know what? If I were in charge of picking folks, I might not have picked them to be in my church, and some of them wouldn't have picked me. But God, as Dale Hartman said, chose us. And He chose us for a reason, and God puts us in the body for a reason, Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So let's just be realistic. We've got to work at this. And all of those commands in the Bible are reflecting the fact that sometimes fellowship is expensive, but it's worth it. The way of the world is to like those who like us, or at least those who are like us. Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount about that. The way of Christ is to love the unlovable and to bring the outsider in. And folks, that is not always easy, to love the unlovable. I used to read Reader's Digest. I used to love to read those little jokes and little personal stories in Reader's Digest. Several years ago, I copied this one out of Reader's Digest. A woman wrote, she said, I went to church last Sunday, and the sermon topic was loving the unlovable. And our minister discussed ways to show Christian concern for unpleasant acquaintances. Immediately after the service, a woman I had known for years, but never on a close personal basis, approached me and invited me home for dinner. Okay? Those are not easy goals. Those are not easy goals. Let me give you another little tidbit here I want you to think about. Folks always tell me they're looking for a friendly church. No, they're not. Folks aren't looking for a friendly church. They're looking for a friend at church. And that's a little different. Now, I can't guarantee that. But I need to be providing opportunities for that to happen. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Number 4, make mutual care a top priority in your church. Make mutual care a top priority. Folks, we are a family. Paul calls us the family of believers. And if we're a family, we're going to take care of our own. Now, there's a lot of things in this world that I can't change. There's a lot of needs in this world I can't meet. But I can take care of my own. And we need to do that in our churches. We need to make sure that we are taking care of our own. The very first church program was a widow's ministry. It was that important to them. And they fed those widows every single day. And that staggers me when I think about that. Every single day. They took care of their own people. I wish I knew. I guess on the day of judgment, God will tell me. But I wish I knew how many hundreds of thousands of dollars people would walk up to me at College Avenue over the years. I was there 28 years and hand me, say, so-and-so has a need, so-and-so has a kid that needs to go to camp, so-and-so had trouble paying their bills this week. Make sure they get this. I'm talking about lots of money. And we had the kind of church where people would just hand me money and say, take care of that. But don't tell them where it came from. But take care of that. Folks, we've got to take care of our own. E.R. Brannan, gospel preacher for over 50 years in Alabama. And years ago in the Gospel Advocate, he told about two episodes that made an indelible impression on his life. The first occurred back in 1937 during the depths of the Depression. Brannan says, we lived in Birmingham, Alabama in 1937. We were members of the old Woodlawn Church. Late one night, the police brought word that my father had been seriously injured in a car accident. He almost died and was hospitalized for several weeks. One of the elders and our preacher, Howard Horton, came to the house and began to unload bags of groceries. After they left, I asked my tearful mother why they had brought the groceries. She said, because we are members of the church. As a 9-year-old boy, I began to realize what a great thing it is to be a member of the Lord's church. I think it's no accident that young boy grew up to be a gospel preacher. Do you? I don't think it's any accident. The second experience came 30 years later. My wife, children, and I were returning from a cemetery where we had buried my sister-in-law who had died after a car accident. The day was cold and dreary, and it was afternoon when we drove up into our driveway. The children were hungry, but no one felt like preparing a meal. While we were gone, some of the ladies from the church got a key to our house, brought in food, and prepared a delicious meal. I was again to learn in a very tangible way what it means to be a member of a church family. Listen, I don't know how folks make it through this world without a good church family. We need a good church family because we need to take care of each other. Number 5, provide practical ways to build partnerships in ministry. To build partnerships in ministry. Here's what most people think about when they think of fellowship. Coffee and donuts. If you ask the average church member, we're going to have a fellowship next Sunday night after church, what are they going to tell you? What are they going to understand? We're going to eat. I mean, that is so ingrained. Fellowship means we eat together, which is fine. The early Christians did eat together. They had agape feasts. They had meals. But that's not exactly the sum total of fellowship. If you read the New Testament carefully, fellowship means sharing together in the work of the gospel. That's really what it means. It means sharing together in the work of the gospel. It doesn't mean coffee and donuts. It means we all go on a mission trip together. It means we all get together and plan a great vacation Bible school. It means we all get together and go take care of some hurricane victims and rebuild a house. It means we work together in the name of Jesus Christ to do some good for God in this world. That's fellowship, and we need to give more and more opportunities. One of the things I'm really encouraged about is a lot more of our youth groups are not just having parties, they're having work parties. Lots and lots of churches now are really getting the young people involved, and even more encouraging, they're getting the adults involved in doing practical ministry, mission work, different projects where people get to work. By the way, if you are an elder or a preacher and you schedule a personal Bible study, can I give you a word of advice? Take somebody with you. always take a partner. And take somebody who wouldn't ordinarily do a Bible study themselves. Just let them ride shotgun. And I tell them, you don't have to say anything. I just want you to come because I need some companionship and they need to get to know another Christian. When that individual that you're studying with is baptized, there will be a bond between the person you brought and the person you taught. And you'll have some good foundations for fellowship. Always take a partner. Number 6, develop practical ways to build relationships in an out-of-the-church box setting. In an out-of-the-church box. Now let me say, and this applies to the rest of what I'm going to say, I am not against church buildings. I have raised millions of dollars for church buildings. I'm not against church buildings. I'm so thankful we have a nice, warm, dry place right now. I'm not against church buildings. But if that's all we have, we're missing something. Did you hear me? That's all we have. What did I tell you about that early church in Acts 2:46? They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. By the way, practical question. How many members did the Jerusalem church have? The Jerusalem Church of Christ. Started out on the first day of business with how many? 3,000. Then we know they had 5,000. Then may have been as many as 10,000. Somebody look real close at this. How did they do that? If you got a church of 5,000 people and they're breaking bread in their homes and eating together with glad and sincere hearts, what does that tell you? Do you honestly believe there was somebody in the Jerusalem church who had a living room big enough for 5,000 people? So what did they have to do? They had to have lots of homes. And they had to organize small groups. Okay? Now, I don't know exactly how that worked. But I know they had to put some effort into making it work. And I know that somebody somewhere had to sit down with a feather pen and a parchment and make it all work out somehow. All right? Now, why am I telling you that? Because there were no church buildings for the first 300 years of Christianity. And what do we lose? Here's my question. What do we lose if we don't restore and experience that personal home dimension of fellowship? And I'm going to tell you, we lose a lot. You don't really get to know somebody unless you're in their home with your knees under the same kitchen table. You really don't. In our society, we cannot know people we cannot love people we don't know, and that takes more than sitting together in pews. It takes more than sitting together in pews. Now I'll tell you why that's important in just a minute. But I mean, this is another Homer Simpson theology. Well, duh, you can't love people if you don't know them. How do you get to know people? Well, it's not going to be looking at the back of their head every Sunday morning because they're in the pew in front of it. That doesn't work. Not anymore. You got to make it work. Which leads me to number 5 and my last point. One of the best ways to build partnerships and relationships is to develop intentional small groups. To develop intentional small groups. I have been involved in small group ministry since the 1970s. I love it. I love it. I had people who would drive 30 miles one way to come to my church because my church had small groups. They love it. They love it. Once you get to experience that level of fellowship, you'll never go back. Now, again, I'm not against church buildings. We had a church building. We had big assemblies. But you really need to have, in our society today, some form or variety of small group so that your people can experience the fellowship that the first century church experienced. Let me give you four key ingredients for small group, or 4.5. Number 1, they need to be intentional. Somebody needs to be in charge. Small groups don't just happen in a healthy church. Somebody's got to be in charge of it. Somebody's got to be dreaming. Somebody's got to have a vision. I had a great small group program. We had anywhere from 20 to 25 small groups every Sunday night in my congregation. I had a fellow in a church one town away. He said, well, we got a small group in our church. I said, you have a small group? He said, yeah, we got a group of about 10 people. They've been meeting together for about 10 years. I said, is this a planned program? He said, no, they just meet together. I said, is it overseen by the elders? Well, no, they just meet together. I said, buddy, you don't have a small group. You got to click. And he looked kind of sheepish. He said, well, they have caused the most trouble in our church. No, they need to be intentional. What do you want to do with them? You need to have a vision. You need to have a goal. You need to have a structure. They need to be voluntary. You cannot assign people to this level of fellowship. We give people the option, but we strongly encourage and invite everyone in our church to be a member of a small group. It's got to be voluntary. They need to meet regularly. This once a quarter business is not going to make it. Small group dynamics develop slowly over time. So you've got to, we would meet during the school year every Sunday night. We would meet every Sunday night. And by the time you get, and by the way, this would happen in my church every year. Every year when we got to the end of a small group session, we would close out in May. People would moan and groan and just really cry. I don't want to miss my small group. I don't want them to break up. I don't want to go to a new group. In the fall and September, we would kick off and we put them in a new group. And about 5 weeks in there, they love the new group. Never fail. But it takes time in a small group to get to know each other and get to love each other. They need to be focused on the Word. And this is why my small group curriculum has been used in over 1,900 churches. Well, actually over 2,000 churches now, because it's based on the Bible. There are a lot of small groups that get together and they meet on the basis of what I call let's all hold hands and share our ignorance. Okay? You need to have God's Word at the foundation of your small group, but it needs to be in a conversational format. It needs to be in a format where people can actually talk and respond and ask questions and be comfortable. So those are the 4 ingredients. I'm going to add one, and this is my own personal bias. It's not necessary, but I'm going to add it. I strongly believe in intergenerational small groups. I strongly believe that we need to mix and match. I don't like this idea of all the young people go off to their group and all the young adults go to their group and all the old folks go to their group and all the middle-aged. That's okay. If your church does it, God bless you. I'm not going to condemn you. I don't like it. Because one of the richest things about my church was we would mix them up. Yes, sir.
So I'm just curious, do you usually have someone who assigns you to a specific group? Or?
That is an excellent question. The question is, does someone assign you to a particular group? We had a sign-up sheet, and we asked people to give us their first, second, and third choice. So it's still voluntary. But we reserve the right to say, well, your group is overweighted. Could you go to group number 2? I don't think we ever I worked with it for 19 years. I don't think we ever had to ask anybody to go to the third choice. But that's a very good question.
I was just asking because it's hard to achieve that when you just have everyone sign up to their own.
That's true. You got to balance. That's you obviously have worked with this. It's got to be voluntary. But the other thing is, if we let a group meet on the same basis with the same group for more than 2 years, we lose our effectiveness. I'll just promise you. We did what we call shuffling the deck. And one way you do that is the core of every group that we would form had a leader, a co-leader, and a host. So that's 3. It could be 3 couples or 3 people. Leader, co-leader, host. Change them every year. Now that's something you can control. Change your leader, your co-leader, and your host every year. And that automatically shuffles the composition to some extent. Good question. Good question. We've been doing this now. We had monthly small groups since 1977, weekly groups since 1996. Our groups were evangelistic, and let me just tell you, 81% of our group, people in our groups, actually invited somebody to their group. Almost half, 46% actually brought somebody to their group. This was what we wanted. We wanted growth, and we got it. We got it. After we started our small groups, they helped the congregation grow 10% in 2000, more than 15% in 2001, and it kept growing after that. That really turned the corner for us, is when we instituted evangelistic small groups. To be honest, we were stagnant. We were kind of at a plateau. And then we brought this in, and it gave us a whole different dimension. Now, I want you to look at this. This is what the preacher wanted. And those of you who are preachers know exactly what I'm about to say. Every one of us has been sitting in the pulpit, not in the pulpit, but behind the pulpit, and seen somebody come in that's brand new. And we sit there and we pray, oh, please, 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 let somebody other than me show an interest in them. Oh, please, 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 let somebody get to know them, shake their hand, and show an interest in them. If I had 20, 25 small groups and they're all trying to grow their group and be evangelistic, they'd almost knock each other down to try to get new people in their group. I had one guy come to my church for the first time on a Sunday morning. I invited him to come back next Sunday and have lunch with me. He came, and he and his wife and his daughter came and had lunch with us. He said, Dan, I got to tell you something. He said, I came to your church last Sunday. I said, yeah, I know that. Thank you. He said, well, before I got out the door, I had 2 people invite me to lunch and 3 people invite me to something called a growth group. And I go, yes! Not in front of him, but internally. That's what you want. That's what you want. Now, I showed you this is what the preacher wanted, and we got it. This is what the people wanted. We asked them, we had a guy come in from outside, from Harding Grad School in Memphis, and survey 80-something of our people and say, what do you like about your group? The number one thing our people said they like is fellowship. Fellowship. Now, I'll circle back to where we began. What are people in American society hungry for? What do they need more than anything else? They need social connections. When we introduced this in my church, our people just totally ate it up. Back when I was preaching my really good sermons on Sunday night, we'd get about 55% retention rate. That'd be about 55% of the Sunday morning attendance would come back on Sunday night. I've been told that's pretty good. We started our small groups, it shot up to 83%. Now, it didn't stay there. It went down in the mid-70s, but that's pretty good. That's pretty good. People in American society are hungry for this level of fellowship. Most encouraging finding of all, when they surveyed our groups, people did have complaints. And the number one complaint is, the time passes too quickly, it's over too soon. Nobody ever said that about my sermons. But listening to a sermon is exactly what you folks are doing. It's passive. You just sit there. When you're in a small group, you get to participate. You get to hear other people's comments. You get to pray together. You get to work together. Folks, that's good stuff.